Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. Okay, let's unpack this. If I were to say the title, The Comedy of Errors by William Shakespeare, you probably immediately picture slapstick, right?
Right, exactly, like pies in the face.
Yeah, you envision actors running across the stage in tights, slamming doors in each other's faces, tripping over their own feet, and engaging in classic physical comedy.
Which, to be fair, on the surface, that is exactly what this play is.
It totally is. I mean, it's widely known as one of his shortest, fastest, and honestly, most chaotic works.
Yeah.
It's a farce built entirely on mistaken identities. But today, we are stripping away that surface-level comedy.
Because you really are.
We are going on a mission to reveal how a 16th century play about separated identical twins and, their separated identical twin servants actually holds up a startlingly accurate mirror to our 21st century anxieties.
Yeah, the architecture of this narrative is incredibly deceptive. I mean, if we only focus on the slamming doors and the situational humor, we miss the profound existential foundation the author is laying down here.
Right. It's so much deeper than the gimmick.
It really is. We are going to extract some incredibly deep insights from this text regarding, the fragility of human identity, the agonizing reality of relational breakdown, and really the absolute lengths to which the human condition will drive us in our search for connection.
Right. We want to show you, the listener, how these characters are navigating the exact same emotional and, psychological crises that you and I deal with today.
Exactly.
And to do that, we have to look at how this play actually opens. Because for a piece categorized as a comedy, the beginning is shockingly dark.
It's incredibly bleak. The historical and human context of the opening scene is, it's absolutely vital for understanding everything that follows. We find ourselves in the city of Ephesus.
Yeah.
And the backdrop is not a sunny, lighthearted carnival. It is a brutal, high-stakes geopolitical trade war.
Like a very real, very lethal trade war.
Exactly. There is an intense, lethal enmity between the city of Ephesus and the city of Syracuse. And this isn't just political posturing. It has fatal consequences.
Right.
The Duke of Ephesus, a man named Silenus, has just decreed a terrifying law. Any merchant from Syracuse seen in Ephesus will be executed. Full stop.
Wow. Just executed on the spot.
Yeah. His goods will be confiscated and his life is forfeit unless he can pay a ransom of 1,000 marks.
Which, we need to pause on that number for a second, 1,000 marks. We learned very quickly that this is an astronomical, impossible sum for the person we meet in the very first scene.
It's unpayable.
Totally unpayable. So we are introduced to an old Syracusan merchant named Aegon. And Aegon is not like some wealthy aristocrat. His entire net worth doesn't even amount to 100 marks.
No, he has nothing.
So before the comedy even begins, the play opens with an old man standing before the Duke, legally condemned to die by sunset. And Aegon is so broken by his life experiences that he doesn't even, beg for mercy.
He's just done.
He's completely done. He literally says, "Proceed, Silenus, to procure my fall, and by the doom of death and woes and all." He's just ready for the suffering to be over. It's a devastating entry point.
It really is. And we have to ask why an author would choose to start a farce comedy with a death sentence and a hollowed-out, broken man.
Right. Why start there?
It's because it establishes a baseline human context of extreme isolation and fractured identity. Aegon isn't just a victim of a trade war or bad timing. He is a man who has been fundamentally erased by trauma.
Wow, yeah, erased by trauma.
Yes. When the Duke asks him to explain why he came to Ephesus despite the death penalty, Aegon tells a story that grounds the entire ensuing chaos in deep human tragedy.
And the backstory he shares is, it's the engine for the entire plot. So we need to slow down and really understand it so the rest of the narrative makes sense.
Definitely.
So Aegon explains that decades ago, he had this beautiful, stable life. He had a wife he deeply loved, Amelia, and they had just welcomed twin sons.
Identical twin sons.
Right, identical. And on the exact same day, in the exact same inn where they were staying, a poor woman also gave birth to twin boys. So Aegon bought these boys to be raised as servants for his own sons.
Right, which was, customary for the era.
Yeah, customary back then.
Yeah.
So you have two sets of identical twins. But on their voyage home, a massive, violent storm hits their ship.
And the way the storm is described is deeply evocative of life's unpredictable cruelty. The sailors terrified for their own lives, abandon the ship, leaving this vulnerable family completely alone on a sinking vessel.
That's terrifying.
It is.
Yeah.
In a desperate, frantic bid for survival, Amelia takes one of their twin sons and one of the twin servants, and she ties the three of them to one end of a spare mast.
Okay.
And Aegon mimics this action, tying himself, the other twin son, and the other twin servant to the opposite end. They are literally floating in the ocean, tethered to each other for mere survival.
And here is the heartbreaking twist, right? Just when the storm breaks and the sun comes out, and they actually spot two ships coming to rescue them, one from Corinth, one from Epidaurus, their makeshift raft hits a massive submerged rock.
Right at the last second.
Exactly. The mast they're clinging to splits right down the middle. Aegon refers to it as an unjust divorce.
What a powerful phrase.
It really is. His wife and the two babies with her are picked up by one ship, while he and the other two babies are pulled aboard the other. So in a single violent instant, the family is cleaved in half.
Completely torn apart.
Yeah. And Aegon explains that he has spent the last 5 summers roaming the farthest, most dangerous reaches of Greece and Asia, desperately searching for his lost family. And this agonizing search is exactly what led him right into the death trap of Ephesus.
This tragedy is the critical foundation. I mean, the problem being explored in this narrative is not simply a comical mix-up of who is who. The real problem is the deep, life-altering trauma of separation. It is an exploration of the desperate, dangerous lengths humans will go to for connection. You know, Aegon is willing to risk his life, to wander into hostile enemy territory, because living without his missing half his family, his flesh and blood, is a fate worse than death itself.
Right. But wait, I have to ask, is it fair to place the blame entirely on the Duke of Ephesus here?
What do you mean?
Well, when you look at Aegon, a man just trying to put his fractured family back together, running headfirst into this wall of arbitrary laws, isn't the Duke just representing the inflexible bureaucratic systems we build today?
Oh, that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, like we draw lines on a map, create rigid border controls, and suddenly those lines dictate life or death, completely failing to account for individual human suffering.
That's actually a highly accurate translation of the political dynamic at play here. The text goes out of its way to show that the Duke is not some unfeeling, sociopathic monster.
Right. He listens to the story.
He does. He actually listens to Aegon's horrific story and is genuinely moved by the tragedy. The Duke even says to him, "Were it not against our laws, against my crown, my oath, my dignity, my soul should sue as advocate for thee."
Wow, so he feels it, but he won't act on it.
Exactly. And here is the tragedy of systemic rigidity. He refuses to bend the system. His oath, his dignity, and the geopolitical posturing of the state take precedence over his humanity.
He gives him one day, right?
Just one single day to try and borrow the ransom money, but otherwise the machine of the state demands a life. It perfectly illustrates how bureaucratic structures become traps. Instead of healing human isolation, these systems perpetuate and enforce it.
Because the system cannot accommodate the nuance of individual pain.
Precisely.
So we are thrust into this intense atmosphere of isolation and a desperate ticking clock search for connection. And this directly sets up what I think is the most transformative insight of the entire text.
Yes, let's get into that.
It's an exploration of how we search for the self, and really the terrifying illusion of separation. Because Aegon isn't the only one in Ephesus searching for lost family. We are introduced to his son, Antipholus of Syracuse.
Right. And to keep the narrative clear for everyone, Aegon raised one of his twin sons, whom he named Antipholus, alongside one of the twin servants named Dromio. They're from Syracuse.
Right.
Unbeknownst to Aegon, his son Antipholus of Syracuse, along with his servant Dromio of Syracuse, has also just arrived in Ephesus.
On the same day.
On the exact same day. They have slipped in right under the nose of this execution decree and have to pretend to be merchants from another city just to avoid being arrested and killed like Aegon.
So Antipholus of Syracuse is walking a massive tightrope here. But he isn't just a traveler in danger. He is a man experiencing a profound existential crisis. I mean, he has been searching for his lost mother and his identical twin brother for years, just like his father.
Yes, he's carrying the same trauma.
Yeah. And he sends his servant Dromio off to their inn to secure their money, and he is left completely alone on the stage. And he delivers what has to be one of the most beautiful, melancholic insights into the human condition.
It really is a moment of profound vulnerability.
I want to read this because it cuts right to the core of what we are talking about today in this deep dive. Antipholus is wandering this strange, hostile city, feeling completely alienated, and he says, "I to the world am like a drop of water, that in the ocean seeks another drop, who failing there to find his fellow forth, unseen, inquisitive, confounds himself. So I, to find a mother and a brother, in quest of them unhappy, lose myself.
What's fascinating here is the precise mechanism of his despair. He's saying that in the very act of looking for his missing family, he is dissolving.
Wow, yeah, dissolving.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the core wisdom being communicated is that human identity is deeply, fundamentally relational. We have this pervasive modern myth of the rugged individual, that we are all autonomous, independent units walking around, and that our identity is generated entirely from within.
Like I and me, regardless of anyone else.
Exactly. But Antipholus reveals the absolute fragility of that concept.
He literally feels like a single drop of water trying to maintain its shape in the middle of the ocean.
Which is physically impossible, right?
Right.
Without his connections, his family, his distinct place in the social fabric, he doesn't know where he ends and the environment begins. He says he confounds himself. And to confound, in this sense, means to mix, to blend, to lose distinction.
Oh, to lose the boundaries of the self.
Precisely. We know who we are largely based on who we are connected to. The roles we play, brother, son, friend, colleague, they form the scaffolding of our ego. When those relational tethers are severed, or when we spend our lives searching for connections we cannot find, we experience a profound dissolution of the self. We lose our psychological shape.
I want you, the learner listening right now, to just reflect for a moment on a time when you felt completely untethered. Think about a moment after a major life transition. Maybe you packed up and moved to a massive new city for a job, and you didn't know a single soul.
Or maybe you went through a devastating breakup.
Yeah, exactly. The person who is your primary mirror to the world was suddenly gone. You walk out onto the street, and there are thousands of people rushing past you, living their intricate lives, and you feel entirely invisible.
Unseen, as the text says.
Unseen. You feel like that unseen drop in a massive ocean. It's a strikingly 21st century reality. I mean, we live in an era where we are technologically hyper-connected, yet we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness because our deep relational tethers feel weaker than ever.
That modern epidemic of loneliness is exactly what this soliloquy is diagnosing. And when we feel untethered internally, when we don't know who we are because our relational scaffolding is missing, what is our immediate psychological defense mechanism? How do we cope?
Oh, that's a great question.
We try to exert rigid control over our external environment. If we lack internal stability, we try to force our external relationships to provide that stability for us.
If the internal world is dissolving, grip the external world as tightly as possible.
Precisely. And this psychological reaction acts as the perfect logical transition into the home life of the other twin, Antipholus of Ephesus, and his wife, Adriana.
Right, let's orient ourselves here. The other twin son, who was saved by the mother but eventually separated from her, ended up living in Ephesus. He is Antipholus of Ephesus.
The local twin.
The local twin. He is wealthy, he is established, and he is married to a woman named Adriana. And here is where the text gets really uncomfortable for a modern reader.
It really does.
We are introduced to Adriana and her sister, Luciana, in Act 2. Adriana is pacing the floor. She is furious and deeply anxious because her husband is late for dinner. She feels neglected and unloved. She asks her sister essentially why men seem to have so much more liberty and freedom to roam than women do.
And Luciana's response is what we can call the deeply uncomfortable text of the play. It is a moment where modern sensibilities will heavily clash with the historical material.
Yeah, it's jarring to read today.
It is. Luciana essentially argues for Adriana's absolute unquestioning submission based on a concept of cosmic hierarchy. She tells her sister that all things, beasts, fishes, and fowls, are subject to the male of their species.
Oh boy.
Yeah. She argues that man, being more divine and lord of the wide world and wild watery seas, is naturally the master to the female. She concludes by telling Adriana, then let your will attend on their accords. She is advocating for total systemic patriarchal dominance as the solution to Adriana's marital anxiety.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because as a modern listener, you hear that speech, and you immediately want to hit the brakes.
Of course.
It sounds like a medieval handbook on how to subjugate women. The instinct is to completely reject Luciana's patriarchal, hierarchical worldview and just write the whole scene off as outdated 16th century sexism. So how do we handle this? What do we do with a text that is presenting a worldview we fundamentally disagree with?
This is a crucial moment for practicing wisdom with discernment. We must absolutely discard the misogynistic hierarchy of the 16th century.
Right. Throw that out.
The author's ancient social assumptions about gender roles are not enduring truths, They are artifacts of their time. However, if we throw out the entire scene in disgust, we miss the brilliant psychological diagnosis of the underlying obstacle to growth being discussed here. We have to look past Luciana's flawed patriarchal framework and examine the actual emotional condition of Adriana. Because amidst all that talk of cosmic hierarchy, Luciana accurately diagnoses that Adriana is operating from self-harming jealousy.
Wow. Self-harming jealousy. That phrase carries so much weight. Because Adriana is deeply hurting herself with her own spiraling anxiety. She is letting her fear consume her.
Destroying her peace.
Yeah. She complains to her sister that she is losing her physical beauty because her husband is neglecting her. She says, "Since that my beauty cannot please his eye, I'll weep what's left away and weeping die."
That line exposes the core issue perfectly. The real obstacle to Adriana's growth isn't her gender. It is her desperate need to control her partner out of a profound fear of abandonment.
Right. She's terrified.
She is taking the massive, complex weight of her own identity and emotional well-being and placing it entirely onto the shoulders of her husband. Later in the text, she refers to herself as a vine and her husband as an elm.
Oh, the vine and the elm.
Right. That is a classical metaphor, but today we recognize it as the textbook definition of codependency.
The vine needs the elm to stand vertically. If the elm moves or falls or, even sways in the wind, the vine collapses completely into the dirt.
Yes. The enduring psychological danger being highlighted here is the peril of making another human being your absolute sole source of stability. Because human beings are fallible, they're distractible and autonomous.
They're just people.
Exactly. If they are late for dinner, if their attention drifts for a single afternoon, your entire world collapses. You end up, as she says, weeping what's left away.
It makes me think of trying to drop an anchor onto a moving speedboat.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, you think you are securing yourself, but you're actually just ensuring that you get dragged violently through the water. The speedboat is going to keep moving, and you're just going to drown holding onto the rope.
The anxiety Adriana feels is entirely real, but her strategy for managing it is disastrous. Trying to grip her husband tighter and tighter, demanding to know his whereabouts every second, well, it only pushes him further away.
Right, which makes her hold on even tighter.
Exactly. His distancing then spikes her anxiety even higher, causing her to grip even tighter. It is a vicious, self-harming cycle. And because of this internal emotional chaos, the environment of their marriage is ripe for a complete catastrophic communication breakdown.
And a catastrophic communication breakdown is exactly what happens. This is the point in the narrative where the farce really kicks into high gear. But when you look closely at the mechanics of the comedy, the farce acts as a brilliant, extended metaphor for how we misunderstand each other.
It really does.
Let's trace the chaos. We have these identical twins, both named Antipholus, both with identical servants named Dromio. The visiting Syracusan twins are wandering around the streets, while the local Ephesian twins are going about their normal daily business. And because they share the exact same faces and names, massive compounding miscommunications start exploding all over the city.
We need to look at how these mix-ups mechanically function. It begins when Dromio of Ephesus, the local servant, runs into Antipholus of Syracuse, the visiting twin.
Right, the first crossing of paths.
Exactly. The local servant thinks he is talking to his master, so he urgently tells him, "Your wife is furious. The meat is burning. You need to come home for dinner."
But Antipholus of Syracuse, who does not have a wife and has only been in town for a few hours, thinks his own servant is playing a cruel prank on him.
Right.
He demands to know where the 1,000 marks in gold he entrusted to him earlier is. The local servant has absolutely no idea what gold he is talking about, and the visiting Antipholus just beats him for his insolence.
It's a complete collision of contexts, and it escalates from there. A local goldsmith named Angelo, who is commissioned to make an incredibly expensive gold chain for the local Antipholus, sees the visiting Antipholus walking down the street.
Oh, man.
The goldsmith walks right up to the visiting stranger and just hands him this massive gold chain.
Which is wild.
Right. The visiting Antipholus is utterly confused. He essentially says, okay, thanks. I guess this town is just full of magical sorcerers who hand out free gold.
Because what else would you assume?
Exactly. He accepts it, assuming it's just the bizarre nature of the city. But the absolute climax of this communication breakdown, the moment that perfectly crystallizes the metaphor, happens in Act 3 in what we can call the locked door scene.
Okay, the locked door scene. This is a masterclass in staging, But it also carries immense thematic resonance regarding relational alienation.
It does.
Let's break down the physical reality of the scene. Antipholus of Ephesus, the local husband, finally returns home for dinner. He has brought a couple of merchants with him to share the meal. But inside his house, his wife Adriana is accidentally having dinner with his twin brother, Antipholus of Syracuse, fully believing she is dining with her husband.
Because the visiting twin was basically dragged there by Adriana, who saw him on the street and refused to let him leave.
Correct. And to ensure they aren't disturbed while they eat and, try to resolve their supposed marital issues, Adriana has ordered the front door to be locked tight. Furthermore, she has commanded the visiting servant, Dromio of Syracuse, to act as the porter and absolutely deny entry to anyone who knocks.
So picture this. The real local husband shows up at his own front door, ready for dinner, and the door is locked against him.
Right.
He knocks, and this voice calls out from inside a voice that sounds exactly like his own servant. The visiting Dromio is inside, fulfilling his orders, and he starts mocking the man outside.
The audacity.
Right. Dromio shouts through the wood, "Your cake here is warm within. You stand here in the cold."
Ouch.
The real husband is outside, freezing, losing his absolute mind. He's threatening to break his own front door down with a crowbar. On stage, it is incredibly funny. It's peak physical comedy. But when you strip away the gimmick of the twins, it is a devastatingly tragic portrait of a marriage.
If we take this ancient farcical setup and translate it to the 21st century, the psychology of the scene becomes, uncomfortably familiar. Think about how often we experience this exact dynamic in our closest, most intimate relationship.
Oh, all the time.
We feel locked out in the cold. We feel like we are standing at the door of our partner's mind or their heart, desperately knocking, trying to get in, and we are being explicitly denied entry. We feel mocked and alienated.
And meanwhile, consider the perspective of the person on the inside of the door. They feel completely justified. They feel like they are protecting their safe space, their internal peace, from a hostile, aggressive intruder.
They are inhabiting two completely different realities while standing inches apart. Adriana genuinely thinks her husband is inside the house acting bizarrely. The visiting twin doesn't know her, he's acting confused, and he keeps talking about leaving town.
So she feels like she's going crazy.
Right. Adriana feels like she's being gaslit. She thinks her husband is playing these cruel, elaborate mind games to torture her. Meanwhile, Antipholus of Ephesus is out on the street, believing that his wife has literally lost her mind, locked him out of his own life, and is feasting and laughing with other people while he suffers in the cold.
Well, the tragedy is that, neither of them is really acting out of pure, calculated malice. They are both operating on incomplete information.
Mm-hmm.
They are experiencing completely different sets of facts. But because they cannot communicate across the barrier of that locked door, they immediately assume the worst about each other's intentions.
This is the ultimate modern text message argument.
Oh, yes. That is the perfect analogy.
You know exactly what I mean. You send a text to a friend or a partner, and maybe it's a little short because you're in a hurry or, holding groceries.
Mm-hmm.
The other person reads that text and, based on their own internal anxiety or past experiences, applies a sarcastic, hostile tone to your words, a tone you never intended.
Right, they read malice into it.
So they text back something defensive.
Mm-hmm.
You read their defensive text as an unprovoked, aggressive attack. Before you know it, you are both furious, sending paragraphs of accusations, completely missing each other's context.
You are both assuming malicious intent.
Exactly. When the reality is just a comical level of misunderstanding. You are both standing on opposite sides of a locked digital door, yelling about things the other person didn't even say.
This reflexive assumption of malice brings us to a very dark turning point in the psychological landscape of the text. Because when we cannot understand someone else's reality, and when the stress of that profound disconnect reaches a boiling point, we don't usually sit down and calmly analyze the missing variables.
Well, we escalate.
We do. We start looking for extreme external diagnoses to explain the behavior that frightens us. The narrative flows to a climax where Adriana is so convinced that her husband is completely broken that she resorts to extreme measures. She brings in a conjurer, a man named Dr. Pinch, to physically bind her husband and perform an exorcism.
She literally brings in an exorcist.
An exorcism.
She thinks he is possessed by demons because that is the only way she can make sense of his erratic behavior. It's total chaos. Mm. Eventually, the visiting twin, Antipholus of Syracuse, who has been dealing with strange women claiming to be his wife, merchants demanding money for gold chains he didn't ask for, and a town seemingly full of madness, is so overwhelmed that he flees with his sword drawn.
He's terrified.
He seeks sanctuary inside a local abbey. And this introduces us to the character of the abbess. She is the head of the abbey, and when she steps onto the stage, she delivers an incredible clinical, psychological breakdown of Adriana's home environment.
The abbess represents a remarkable voice of objective authority and insight here. She essentially halts the chaotic momentum of the farce to conduct a relational autopsy.
I love that phrase, relational autopsy.
Yeah, she interrogates Adriana about what has been going on in her marriage. She asks, how have you been treating him? What has the atmosphere of your home been like?
And Adriana tells the truth.
She does. Adriana, trying to justify her anxiety, admits that she has been constantly badgering him. She admits to urging him about his whereabouts at dinner, in bed, when they are alone and when they are in company. She confesses, still did I tell him it was vile and bad.
She admits she never gave him a moment of peace.
Not one.
And the abbess completely pounces on this admission. She doesn't offer Adriana empty comfort. She diagnoses the toxicity of the environment. She tells Adriana, the venom clamors of a jealous woman poisons more deadly than a mad dog's tooth. And then the abbess makes this brilliant connection between the toxic emotional environment and actual physical and mental health.
This is the key part.
Yeah, listen to her exact words. Unquiet meals make ill digestions. They're of the raging fire of fever bread. And what's a fever but a fit of madness?
The abbess is unpacking what we would now call the somatic connection. She understands how the mind, the body, and our relational environment are intrinsically biologically linked. She points out that when sweet recreation is barred, when a person is constantly subjected to brawls, upbraidings, and anxiety during the very times they're supposed to be eating and resting, it inevitably leads to a breakdown. She says it causes moody and dull melancholy. The abbess is literally describing how toxic relational stress ruins physical health.
Wait, hold on. Is the abbess letting the husband off the hook here?
Yeah.
Is she victim-blaming Adriana?
Oh, that's a common reaction.
Because let's look at the facts. Antipholus of Ephesus did just try to break his own door down with a crowbar. After being locked out, he was seen hanging out with a local courtesan to spite his wife. He has been generally awful and reactive. Is it really fair for the abbess to say, oh, it's your fault he's going crazy because you nagged him?
That is a vital question, and it requires us to look at the text with a lot of nuance. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the abbess is not absolving the husband's bad behavior.
Okay, good.
The text never pretends that Antipholus of Ephesus is innocent or justified in his reactions. What the abbess is doing is pointing out an unavoidable psychological and physiological mechanism. She isn't making a moral judgment on Adriana's right to feel insecure, She is stating a law of nature.
Right.
She is saying that a hostile, continuously anxious environment inevitably destroys human flourishing, regardless of who started it.
It's about cause and effect. It's the ecosystem of the house.
Exactly. Modern medical science absolutely validates the abbess's diagnosis here. We know definitively that chronic relational conflict, living in a home where you are in a constant state of fight or flight, spikes your cortisol levels.
Oh, the stress hormone.
Right. That sustained hormonal stress leads to systemic inflammation in the body. The abbess calls this systemic inflammation a fever. And we know that chronic inflammation is directly linked to cognitive decline, severe anxiety, and depression.
Which the abbess calls madness.
Exactly. The warning here is universal. You cannot poison the well of your home with constant venom clamors and then expect to drink healthy, life-giving water from it.
That is profound. If the meals are unquiet, the digestion is ill, both literally in our stomachs and figuratively in our minds. We cannot process our lives if we're always defending ourselves.
Beautifully said.
So this fever, this absolute peak of chaos, finally breaks in Act V. The resolution of this play is a brilliant, intricate unraveling of all these tangled threads. The Duke arrives at the Abbey. And remember, the Duke is accompanied by Egan, the old man from the very first scene, who is still scheduled to be executed at sunset.
The ticking clock that opened the narrative finally runs out.
Right. The sun is setting. The execution is imminent. So the Duke, Egan, Adriana, and both sets of twins finally converge in one single location outside the Abbey.
The final showdown.
And when the two Antipholuses and the two Dromios finally step out and stand side by side, everyone's mind is completely blown. The townspeople are staring at impossibilities. The Duke looks at the two identical masters and the two identical servants, and he says, one of these men is genius to the other. And so of these, which is the natural man and which the spirit, who deciphers them?
This moment of ultimate revelation offers us a profound comparative insight. In many broader wisdom traditions, the idea of meeting your identical double is not just a neat plot trick. It is a powerful, transformative archetype.
Right.
In Jungian psychology, for example, meeting your double represents confronting the shadow. The shadow is composed of all the hidden, unconscious parts of yourself that you have repressed or refused to acknowledge.
Yeah.
We project our shadow onto others because it's too painful to see in ourselves.
So it's like a physical manifestation of that.
Yes. By literally coming face to face with his exact copy, Antipholus is forced to reconcile the disparate halves of his own psyche.
How does that map onto Buddhist philosophy? Because you mentioned earlier that there are parallels there as well.
Ah, yes. In a Buddhist framework, this climax can be likened to the realization of anatta, or non-self. It is the sudden, shocking understanding that the isolated, independent ego is an illusion.
That we aren't totally separate.
Right. Throughout the play, these characters believed they were singular, autonomous entities, but seeing their double destroys the illusion of their uniqueness. It proves that their identity is dependent on causes and conditions outside their control, like a shipwreck 30 years ago.
So the chaos they endured in Ephesus, the beatings, the exorcisms, the locked doors, the confusion, it wasn't just a funny series of accidents. It was mechanically necessary.
It was a necessary crucible. Both sets of twins and the people who loved them, like Adriana, had constructed false, rigid, isolated identities based on limited information and trauma. The madness of Ephesus systematically dismantled those rigid structures. They had to go through the fire of complete and total confusion. They had to reach a point where they questioned their own sanity so that their illusions could be shattered, allowing them to finally see the full, interconnected reality of who they were.
The ultimate reality is revealed when the abbess steps forward into the crowd. In the final, most moving twist of the text, she reveals her true identity. She is Emilia. She is Aegeon's long-lost wife, the mother of the Antipholus twins, who was saved by a different ship all those decades ago.
It's an incredible moment.
She has been living in Ephesus this entire time. The Duke, moved by the miraculous restoration of this family, immediately waives the 1,000-mark ransom and pardons Aegeon. The family is entirely restored, and the specific language Emilia uses to describe this reunion is so important.
Pay attention to her words here.
It's not just a happy family get-together. She looks at her grown sons and says, 33 years have I but gone in travail of you, my sons, and till this present hour my heavy burden ne'er delivered.
Notice the metaphor she employs. Travail means the labor of childbirth.
Oh, wow.
She is saying that the trauma of the shipwreck 33 years ago initiated a painful, protracted labor that has only just now finished. This wasn't just a physical reunion, it was a spiritual rebirth for the entire family. They are finally delivered from the isolation and the fractured identities that have defined their lives since that storm tore them apart.
After so long grief, such nativity, it is a beautiful conclusion. The lost drops of water have finally found the ocean. So we've gone from a 16th century geopolitical trade war to the somatic impacts of stress, all the way to Jungian shadow theory and Buddhist ego dissolution.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. The question for you, the learner listening to this deep dive, is how do you actually use this? How does this ancient text change the way you live tomorrow morning? Let's get into the practical how-to.
There are two very clear, deeply actionable practices we can pull from the mechanics of this text. The first relates directly to the farcical miscommunications of the twins, and we can call it the principle of charity in communication.
How does that work in practice?
In the play, every single time someone acts in a confusing or erratic manner, like demanding 1,000 marks in gold out of nowhere or denying that they just ate dinner, the other person immediately assumes malice, stupidity, or literal demonic madness.
Right.
The practical application for us is the discipline of pausing before reacting. When your partner, your colleague, or your friend seems to be speaking utter nonsense or acting totally out of character, you have to force yourself to practice a moment of reflection.
You have to stop and ask yourself, am I actually talking to the person I think I'm talking to right now, or am I projecting an identity onto them?
Yeah, that is the exact question. You must train yourself to assume missing context rather than malicious intent.
Assume missing context rather than malicious intent. I love that.
Just as Adriana thought she was arguing with a cruel, gaslighting husband when she was actually talking to a deeply confused stranger, we often argue with the idea of a person we hold in our heads rather than the complex reality of the person standing in front of us.
Wow, yes.
Practicing charity means pausing and saying, this doesn't make sense to me. What information am I missing? What context do they have that I don't? Instead of immediately concluding, you are doing this specifically to hurt me.
Assume missing context. rather than malicious intent. If you apply that to your text messages, your marriage, or your workplace, it changes everything.
It really does.
The second practice comes straight from the abbess's brilliant diagnosis of the home, and it's about guarding the digestions of your relationships.
The abbess powerfully illustrated how constant anxiety, bickering, and the inability to rest destroy our physical and mental health. The challenge for the listener is to conduct an honest audit of your shared spaces.
Here's a question for you to actively reflect on today. Are your meals, your living rooms, your weekends, your times of rest filled with venom clamors and anxiety? Are you constantly bringing up past arguments, workplace stress, or lingering resentments the very moment you sit down to eat with your family?
Are you ruining your own digestion?
Exactly. Are you ruining your own digestion?
You must practice creating and enforcing firm boundaries around times of rest. If you want to prevent the fever of modern burnout and systemic inflammation, you have to fiercely protect the spaces designed for what the abbess calls sweet recreation.
You have to guard it.
You cannot digest your food, you cannot process your emotions, and you cannot understand your life in a state of chronic conflict. Guard your rest as if your life depends on it, because biologically it does.
Guard your digestions. Protect your rest. And practice charity before you react. That is an incredibly profound set of tools to take away from a play about slamming doors.
As we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave the listener with one final provocative thought to mull over regarding how we view others.
Okay, let's hear it.
Notice how quickly everyone in the city of Ephesus was willing to believe that their loved ones were literally possessed by demons or witches. They were so convinced of their own perspective that they actually brought in an exorcist to bind a man.
It's wild to think about.
It is. They were infinitely more willing to believe in supernatural malice and madness than to simply admit that the world was more complex than their limited perspective could grasp.
Yeah, it was easier for them to say he's a demon than to pause and say, maybe I just don't have all the facts here.
And the critical question that builds on this for our own lives is, how often do we do the exact same thing today? How often do we label someone else as crazy, toxic, or narcissistic simply because their reality doesn't perfectly match our assumptions? Are we performing our own modern exorcisms, canceling people, banishing them from our lives, diagnosing them from afar, when what we really need is the humility to realize we might only be seeing half the picture?
That is a thought that is going to linger long after we finish. It really makes you wonder who is standing on the other side of your locked doors.
Yeah.
That's the heart of this section.
This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.